Thank you very much for that very interesting and riveting talk. One of the topics and one of the comments that came up with that from that conversation was how can art activate ideas for both the makers and the audience? How can art and patronage instigate or inspire social change? So for our next panel, please join Dr. Zoé Whitley and Dana Farouki as we discuss art as activism.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much, and thrilled to be in conversation with Zoe. Big fan, and we'll hear a lot about her epic show that was really transformative, and I got to see it in 2 cities, in London and New York, so I feel lucky. But I think, we really just wanted to begin by talking about, the power of art. And essentially, I think when we talk about art and activism, we're talking about the power of art and the way that artists are, at the end of the day, truly thinkers. And the art that they make help us to understand each other. It helps us to wonder, and it's illuminating. And through this mutual understanding, it instills empathy and compassion. And I think, especially for artists in this part of the world, we're eager to kind of ensure that we're understood correctly, and sometimes that's tough, with kind of the way things have always been. So artists working here and working today are really kind of eager to kind of present their ideas, present their thoughts, and instill this possibility of social change. And I think, we were talking about some of the artists in the biennial, and it's remarkable because I think artists are even more empowered here than they are kind of in any part of the world. And there are examples even in this biennial of, like with Manal Doyen, who has made art, for over a decade, talking about and reflecting on the female condition in this country, and actually even kind of artworks that she made in 2011 reflecting on, the guardianship laws are, in some ways, she was part of the process of making those changes. So, we are here and kind of, in the presence of this great biennial, reflecting in some ways on both artists locally in Saudi Arabia and in addition to artists from China. And, I think there are a lot of similarities in that, both these countries are undergoing radical change. And here, we see that in terms of great progress and excitement. And I think we're going to look at some examples today of great works of art and ones that have done that as well. So, Zoe, would you like to start?
Sure. I mean, we can look at some slides, but this is, even as the topic was presented to us, it gave me pause, because when I think of activism, I think of, incredible moments in history, a single individual standing in front of a military tank, or, standing in front of horses to get women the right to vote. If we think of the suffrage movement in Britain, these kind of big epic moments. And so I would never conflate curatorial work with a form of activism. And even as we prepared for this talk, one of the things that I'd mentioned in email was, and I don't have the quote with me because I thought I wanted to speak directly to you, but to kind of paraphrase a quote by a really extraordinary American painter named Carrie James Marshall, who kind of rejects this idea that art can compel you to do anything, that art is activism, that, at best, what it can help you do is to maybe see things slightly differently and to question something. And I think that as an ambition or something that a work can do is already pretty phenomenal. So I think this way, I'm interested in maybe reframing the discussion, even from the start, around the notion of art and impact, because I think impact can happen in a lot of different ways. And I know there are artists in the audience, but one of the artists I was speaking with earlier today, Sarah Ibrahim, when I mentioned that to her, her response I found very moving, because she said, breathing is activism. And I think even if we were to take that as a starting point, you know, that your very existence can actually be a form of activism, and not always in a way that has to be kind of violent or defiant, but that can be about making a statement, that might be a very generative place for the conversation to happen. So I put together a bunch of slides, but it's going to be weird because then I have to look back to see what they are. So I'm the director of a nonprofit space in East London called Chisenhale Gallery. That used to be what our openings looked like in the pre-COVID times. And this is an exhibition that just closed with us. And I pause on this not because of the conceptual work of Ryndon Johnson, but actually because one of the recent forms of activism that we've had to start thinking about very seriously, what it even means to contribute to the climate crisis by creating exhibitions. Our mission at Chisenhale is to work with artists we believe in to create new works of art, and we work with them over a 1 to 2 year period. And the nature of temporary exhibitions means you're making things, and that work goes on, but equally there may be temporary walls or other structures that are fundamentally kind of creating and contributing to a waste system, or you know, how we travel internationally, what that does in terms of carbon emissions. You know, all of these kind of big global issues that aren't necessarily there for the art world to solve, but it's part of the world we're in. And with this exhibition, we were able to use the plinth and base of the previous work by an Iranian artist who's based in Canada named Abbas Akavan, and to then use that to create what is an incredibly monumental screen onto which we projected. And this came about in a way that I think connects to the previous talk, because so much of it comes from talking to artists about what matters to them, how they want to live in the world, and what it means as a curator to be a conduit for that. And so it was Abbas's idea, and Ryndon thought that it was the perfect way to then create this support. So it happened very much as a dialogue, or almost like a passing of the baton.
Just responding immediately.
Exactly,
and
from
being
one
able
artist
to
to the
kind
next.
of, you know, understand that this was important to the artist, and that you were able to kind of make that happen. Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of reaction, you know, and really having it be something that's kind of essential to them is what inspires and propels an artist to make work.
Yeah, and I think it's, and I would want to put the question back to you, because you've worked in a way that is really interesting to me, because you've worked in quite a nimble way, both in institutions, because I would say institutionally this mattered to us as well, to be thinking through how we make these changes in ways that show an environmental commitment. So not to just have an environmental policy on a piece of paper, but to live it and to act it. And I know that in your profession and in your life that you support artists in a number of ways as well, both as a collector, but then also working with institutions. So I'm interested in how you frame that notion of activism and impact.
Yeah, I mean, for example, so I do a number of things, including sitting on some boards of institutions that I feel very passionately about, based in New York City. One of which is, for example, I also started out as a curator for the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi long ago. And at some point, the Guggenheim in New York came to me, and Nancy Spector, you know, had a conversation. She was like, so what should we be doing differently in New York now? And I'm like, well, you know, you've invested, you know, your resources intellectually, and kind of sending curators to the region, and kind of, you know, committing in a big way to having a home in Abu Dhabi. I'm like, but at this point, you've had very much of a reflection of that presence in New York. And, you know, they weren't having shows that incorporated, you know, Middle Eastern artists into the narrative. They weren't thinking, you know, when they had these kind of curatorial meetings where they're talking about the Rotunda shows and these kind of major retrospectives that really are the anchor of the Guggenheim's program, none of the artists that, you know, were being discussed in the region were having, you know, this kind of similar presence. in New York. And she was like, it's true. So we founded this acquisitions committee where we now kind of ensure that there's a consistent and regular, a more inclusive dialogue and narrative that consistently not only adds to the museum's collection, but another part of the museum's program that was always kind of very beloved is this performance program that happens annually in the Rotunda. And so now we have an annual kind of performance that ensures that there will always be kind of, these important artists also reflected in New York. And the Guggenheim actually just closed its first Rotunda show of an Arab artist, the painter Etel Adnan. So, I think that's something that I'm proud of and kind of work to ensure happens in New York in terms of kind of my involvement and my passion for the region and passion for so many of the artists that are working here.
So in that respect, then we start to see a pattern emerging of how representation is itself a form of activism. That if you have an unquestioned kind of cultural monolith and you're not willing to kind of push that, whether that's through artists pushing that or whether it's through curators and arts advocates and board members kind of doing this in a synergistic way, because that's where and how the change happens.
Yeah, I mean, I think also in terms of, we were talking a little bit about support of ideas and support of artists and support of missions. I think you also, you have to kind of identify what really moves you and what, you care deeply about in terms of kind of advocating. And another example of an organization that I feel very strongly about is Creative Time, which its mission was very specifically to realize artists' dreams. And many of these dreams are kind of rooted in, this kind of idea that art can impact social change and lead to progress. Did you want to, I think your slides are up, sorry.
Yeah, I just moved them along so that we could, because I think that for the nature of this conversation, the other talk that I had been participating in here the other day involved artists sitting around the room here in the floor. It was a completely different layout. So it was a bit more like a living room. And it was, I think, very important to hear for it to be a conversation. And so I think it would be, I'm encouraged to open this up as soon as possible, because there are people in the audience who I know have come for something, and rather than saying, here are highlights from, our careers, I think it's probably much more interesting and conducive for the short time we have together to ask you what it is you would like to discuss, because obviously the topic was a draw, but again, knowing that the topic is only a loose frame and something that we can work with, I think we can move with it. But the project for which I'm probably best known is an exhibition that happened in 2017 and only finished touring in 2020 during COVID. I think Houston was the final stop, and maybe that was the 6th, 5th. But an exhibition happened. This is to your point about representation. So from 2013 until 2019, I was a curator at Tate Modern, which was a real education. And again, this notion of even what you think a curator is, even while you're being it, you can think, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm this thing. And interestingly, the way that Tate Modern framed itself as an institution that was born in 2000 and took over, again, a part of London, it really announced something new, a real moment of change for popular engagement with the art of the present day. And this was in particular because it was on a brownfield site by the River Thames, not a part of town that people were frequenting. A public transportation stop came after, and it's known in some circles, or people who kind of write about contemporary art, in particular curatorial studies, as the Tate effect, because then restaurants and other places started to kind of emerge around there because of this kind of massive influx of people to see work that was created. And this site, a former turbine hall, so an industrial building, was meant to be the place where work after 1900 was shown that really represented international modern and contemporary art practice. But in reality, the parameters of what constituted international were incredibly narrow. And one of the things Tate did incredibly well from the beginning was really to look at modern and contemporary North American art. But even within that story, you know, there are kind of voices that are heard and voices that aren't heard. So to start from like a reasonably obvious place, so this was a story that was very important to me because of my own background and as one of few Black curators who were working in that institution at the time, to begin to develop an exhibition that looked at post-1960 African-American art and really looking at debates that were going on within artist circles, which was what was fascinating, because again, it's artists talking to artists and artists not agreeing with one another on what the stakes were and how best to express actually what it meant to be a Black artist at a particular moment in American history, a moment that was a real turning point in American history. So this kind of fight for civil rights, a fight for equal rights, and a number of artists attended the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom together in 1963. At the time, we referred to ourselves as a people as Negro. And so a question was kind of asked and answered by this group of artists that attended. You know, what is the role of the Negro artist? And the premise of the exhibition is very, very simple. They gave no single answer. You know, the fact that there were so many different ways and registers to answer that question actually became the impetus for absolutely brilliant innovations in abstract works, but also in figuration, in sculpture, in video. And so this way of thinking through how we find ourselves and see ourselves within this work, it answered a really key question. This can be an exhibition because we can show it. We can show these different positions and disagreements and quotes from artists on the walls. And you can actually move from room to room and be in a circumstance where you're nodding your head with every single artist, even though what one person said is diametrically opposed to what the other said, but you can start to feel it and sense it. And as a project too, it was maybe, for me, felt like a very important time to actually ask who the exhibition was for, and to make sure that it was for young Londoners, the majority of whom have at least one non-white parent. So this way of thinking that, you know, maybe even in our National Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art, you wouldn't see yourself or set foot, and you don't have to be from this particular background to maybe get something else out of it. And I think for that reason, and for asking and answering some of those questions, and for keeping artists at the core of what we were doing, that really helped to flesh out a number of things that people found really, really exciting. And a number of the artists in the show were activists, you know, in the conventional sense. So, you know, out in the streets advocating for things. And while we were doing the research, the thing that fascinated me and my co-curator, Mark Godfrey, was every single artist we met at a certain point when we were talking said, oh, well, I was never Black enough for so-and-so. And we might be in the living room of like a Black Panther, you know, someone who, you know, by any other definition. And I think that this is something to think about as well when we think about activism. So much of it has to do with how we define ourselves, or how we have to redefine ourselves and find a definition that we are comfortable with, rather than one that's imposed upon us. And I think that was really the through line throughout the project. I might have some pictures, but I'm not sure what order they're in. Oh, sorry, that's me pointing at a painting of Barclay Hendricks, but I'll move swiftly on. That's probably a perfect example. In this one room, we have a work by Frank Bowling, a matte painting that he made in the floor of the Hotel Chelsea in New York City when he first started to think about how not to paint on like a tripod and an easel, and to really think differently about the possibilities of what paint might do. Sam Gilliam on that back wall, coming off the stretcher altogether, with this wonderful work called Carousel Change, which is now in Tate Collection. In the foreground is a work by Martin Puryear, and the work is called Self. So it is a form of a self-portrait, but very different from the types of self-portraits that were in the previous room. And I moved past the previous image, but where there were images, for instance, of Barclay Hendricks, who is a painter and painted self-portraits, but then you can have a very different iteration of that same expression. And I think bringing that together in a way that even if I'm not there walking you through the show, people could feel and sense and understand, was itself a form of making an impact within an institutional context.
How many artists were in that show?
65.
65.
So I'm really proud of that, because I always say that we made 65 promises and we kept each one. So, yeah.
I mean, also just kind of as a great kind of introduction, it's a feat to have an exhibition travel to 5 or 6 cities. It doesn't typically happen. I think it's important, you know, to kind of have those like simple conversations.
But equally, even the exhibition, the tour that ended up happening in America wasn't a given, because there were a lot of assumptions about its genesis. So right away we were told by most of the American institutions we approached, like, well, why would we take an American exhibition from a British institution? If we want to cover that subject, we'll do it ourselves. Mm-hmm. And it actually took, again, a number of important advocates, the director of the Ford Foundation, the president of the Ford Foundation, Darren Walker, among them, really the key voice in this, to make connections for us. And by the end of it, we'd had institutions that had literally emailed us and said no, emailing us asking for the show. So there'd been this kind of complete turnaround. But it's interesting to see how you can start in one place and something can feel impossible, and then things become really possible or become even sought after. I guess what I'm trying to do as much as possible is not keep it specific to this, but kind of extrapolate some things that maybe can be takeaways for people. But yeah, that was a room I really loved. So maybe we can keep that slide up there. Don't have to go through all the rest of them.
Yeah. What about in terms of, we talked briefly in our emails about women kind of, you know, often being part of this conversation. How many of the artists in the exhibition were female?
This is a very good question. Relatively few, and this is actually because it was one of the stories that we ended up telling. I remember Dinga McCannon coming to visit the exhibition. It was one of the artists in Where We At Collective, a Black women's collective. And she said she remembered making a phone call to, she's an artist, and was making a phone call to a fellow artist and was saying, you know, I'd really like to meet other Black women artists. Do you know any? And her friend's answer was, I don't know any Black women artists. And he was literally speaking to her. And so this sense of not even seeing what's in front of you became a reason to then, even within these larger activist groups, to think, what's my specific position? What do I need to do? So within that first room of the exhibition and that Spiral Project and the artists who attended the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, the youngest member who ended up being part of this informal collective that met on a regular basis was Emma Amos. And so she was in the show. And as we moved through, Faith Ringgold was one of the artists who we put in the room just opposite, kind of facing this other group, because she wrote to them and wanted to become a member. And they turned her down and said that her work would find its own friends. They'd kind of kept, and it did. So there's a happy ending to this story, but I think there are these moments as well where...
And Faith Ringgold, we were talking about the other day, has gotten kind of, you know, incredible recognition, I would say, like in the last... I mean, obviously has always been super significant, but the narratives have been changing. It's kind of these major institutions.
And that's wonderful because, you know, Hans
where
Ulrich
MoMA
Obrist,
did the
who's
rehang
here,
and, yeah.
Hans Ulrich is always very generous in saying that this exhibition is where he first saw Faith's work, and then invited Faith for the Serpentine solo, and she has one coming up at the New Museum that opens in a couple of days. But as we move from room to room, Elizabeth Catlett is a really phenomenal sculptor. And she's an interesting example of someone who's an artist and activist, because she felt that the medium that she used determined different modes of expression. So she ended up leaving the United States and expatriating to Mexico. And in Mexico, she worked with the Taller de Gráfica Popular. I hope I remember that correctly. But used printmaking as a form of activism because of the legibility of the images, and then would still work in making these absolutely, I don't know, it's like poems in wood, and through her sculptural practice, but felt that they were able to, that the work was able to do two different things and then satisfy these different sides of her creativity. And then an artist from Los Angeles named Betty Saar, we ended up devoting a whole room to, recreating part of her 1973 exhibition at Cal State Los Angeles based on a black and white photograph. And we sat together and she kind of described to me this blue-gray, and then we went through all these color samples to recreate this wall. And it was a wonderful moment to then show it and to have those works kind of brought together again and live in this space. And in that room, I think we were so interested in the fact that, again, there are these ways of how you might think of an artist's life and how you start to underestimate it. So the fact that she's this black woman artist you'd think might mean certain things, but her world was so big. And I was always fascinated in the fact that she was able to travel all around the world and then use these different reference points to then put those assemblages together. And she had been inspired by an artist who famously had never left New York. So that artist was creating these worlds in these boxes, even though he'd never left the city. And yet she's able to then go around the world and then take those influences back and then put those into these wonderful assemblages and condense them. But each of those registers, someone like Howardina Pindell, another artist, a woman artist in the exhibition, was also a curator at the Museum of Modern Art, so the first black woman in one of those roles. And again, was dealing with this duality at the time of having to face institutional racism and calls from her peers for boycotting a number of institutions, and then also having to go to work every day. Mm-hmm. And I think that's activism too, is trying to navigate like what you need to do to live your life. And so again, going back to that point of there not being one right answer, or an activist doesn't only look like X or Y, or doesn't only happen in the political arena, and that could happen in these ways that are soft or quiet. You know, I asked my own grandmother about, her role in the civil rights movement, and she was always very honest about, having had very young children to raise, and that it wasn't a possibility for her to go out into the streets and potentially get arrested or physically harmed because she had a family to look after. And I think that's also a form of activism, keeping your family safe. So I think that this way of trying to understand people and artists' perspectives and how they then make those visible, I think gives us such an exciting range of possibilities for how impact can be created and where it can be found.
It's true. Kind of activist art can look so, so very different and can manifest itself in so many different ways. And actually, if we, look a little bit later, but one of my first image was actually a painting.
Let's go to yours.
Okay, a painting of Etel Adnan, who, was actually a writer before she was a visual artist. And her writings, I think it's connected.
Stacked back to back.
Are they? Maybe not. Anyway, no, it isn't. Oh,
Okay.
No. But anyway, she was a writer who kind of focused mostly on writing about politics and active protest, but at one moment, in 1955, and she wrote primarily in the language of French, which was to her at some point, she became embarrassed by the fact that she wrote in French and was a French speaker because it was kind of reminiscent and reminded her of
The colonizing.
exactly.
Yeah.
So it was her colonial history, and so one day she kind of said to herself, like 1955. I'm going to stop writing, because she didn't want to continue to write in French, and that was the language that she could write in. I'm going to start painting. And she said that, she writes about what she sees, but she paints what she is, and paints what she, and so these kind of sublime paintings that, appear, just so kind of serene, but they tell a different story too, and they tell this story of her kind of, specific history, and one where she was, born somewhere and lived a million different other places, and, lived through the Lebanese Civil War, and, had to move to America and then move to France, and these paintings are very much like a reflection of, that stormy and, kind of difficult life that she lived. And there are other things as well, kind of things that are more obviously activist. So this is Tanya Bruguera, who is I think if you thought of an artist who is an activist in every way, I mean, she would come up, a Cuban artist who very clearly kind of makes comments and work that reflects kind of her objections to certain political structures and the immigration situation, and she created these series of flags for Creative Time, and dignity has no nationality. So she's kind of telling also her story and the story of her past. And I just feel like so many of these artists are just really, making statements that are very personal, but yet they resonate for so many, and and again, it helps us to understand them, and it helps us to kind of be compassionate to kind of varied stories. Kara Walker's A Subtlety. Always a favorite, but...
Well, that one, to me, is interesting because I feel like with that one, the activism or, this statement was actually much more about the work that happened after the work. And it was in the documentation that the artist made of the work and of the public's consumption of this kind of monumental Black woman's body and this kind of the levels of disrespect or the not taking seriously of it, and that there became this critique within this critique of how these kind of big works of art are then produced and ta-da, but there are these other kind of violences that are visited upon as a result, and that, so yeah, I encourage anyone to take a look at that film. It's online.
Interesting. Guerrilla Girls, also like a very, obvious activist work, but I actually had a chance to hear them in person this summer, and I think they've aged, so they're not so kind of perhaps on trend or super current, but again very much kind of on this kind of frontier of really making clear these injustices that happen in institutions with respect to kind of females represented and at institutions and museums across the country. An artist working in the 50s in Lebanon, in Egypt, Inji Aflatoon, a pioneer who was identified herself as an activist, was very much present in kind of all these public protests, and was imprisoned herself and created these beautiful portraits of female prisoners while she was imprisoned.
And I think that's the thing, to think that, the stakes can be incredibly high. Mm-hmm. And, one of the reasons why the Guerrilla Girls used to wear masks is to kind of protect their individual identities. And in some cases, it's because of, the art careers or other things that they had in other parts of their lives. But again, this, what does anonymity afford provides this kind of, literally a mask in some cases to then be able to make statements that certainly, at the time would have been very provocative.
Emily Jacir, a favorite artist of mine as well, Palestinian artist, whose work, this work Where We Come From, I think, seminal work. And this work in particular, we're talking about empathy. My husband was at like some kids' cocktail party, and he was asked like, oh, where are you guys from? And it was in New York, and he was like, oh, I'm Lebanese and my wife is Palestinian. He was like, oh, she said, oh, okay, Palestinian. I never really understood the plight of the Palestinian people, but recently I was at an art gallery I saw this work, Where We Come From, which documents kind of, Emily's call to the public, Palestinians who weren't able to go to Palestine, and she asked them, what would you like for me to do for you in Palestine? And people came up with the simple things that they wanted, desperately wanted to experience, but couldn't because of their passport, or, the occupied territories having certain regulations and rules, going to eat knafe with your grandmother, or picking an orange from an orange tree. And this woman, kind of very naively in a way, but saw this work, and she understood the issue, better than she ever had before.
Well, I would definitely say that Emily and her sister qualify as activists on every level, and they're rebuilding their art foundation and the library after it having been very seriously damaged. So I think that there are these kind of real world consequences to underlying a lot.
And
of
they
this
have
work.
no choice but to kind of, persist and to kind of to keep working. Another work of Emily's from Documenta. Manal, who is featured here in the biennial, and this was the work that we were talking about earlier, Suspended Together, that reflects upon the previous law where women in Saudi Arabia had to have guardians in order to travel, and again the power of art to kind of change these kinds of things. Another view of that one, and that was from 2011 in Venice. Here's Manal again, Tree of Life. And then we wanted to talk a little bit about kind of patronage. We briefly talked about it, and I'm sure you can, especially being close to Darren, I mean, this incredible form of patronage, Aggie Gunn's Art for Justice Fund, which Agnes Gunn is like my idol and a mentor. I was lucky enough to have her chair the board of MoMA PS1, where I've sat on the board for 15 years. And she kind of, had been propelled by the fact that she has black grandchildren who she became concerned, about their future. And, she has this incredible art collection. And she said to herself, one day I have this masterpiece, amusingly called Masterpiece, that hung in her dining room wall. And she said, I'm going to sell this $100 million painting, and I'm going to donate the proceeds of that sale, $100 million, to reform criminal justice in America. And they now kind of fund art projects that specifically are focused on prison reform and mass incarceration. And this kind of, I mean, she's always been kind of, selfless, but, this kind of realization that she had, and she said, I had enjoyed this painting on my wall for, 30 years. And I thought to myself, but it could do so much good. And, these are the incredible acts of patronage that have the power to kind of, make real change. And then, talking about kind of some local patrons too, Suha Shoman, a Palestinian artist who has also established a museum, a home for artists in Jordan. And she really sought to establish this museum as a refuge, a place, a home for, so many of the artists in this region that, have kind of endured strife in so many ways. And the fact that she herself had kind of been born in Jerusalem, but was raised in Cairo, and then kind of, settled in Jordan after studying in Lebanon. And she never felt like she had a home for herself, so she wanted to ensure that artists, from this part of the world always had a home in the region. So there are incredible kind of acts of patronage also. I mean, I think the short end of the story is that, there's these stories have the power to kind of make change.
I think we can. Yeah, I would like to. Yeah, if there are any questions. Oh.
Thanks, Zoe. Thanks, Dana. I think you guys both brought up some very interesting aspects to how art can instigate social change or implement a form of activism. And I think what's interesting is that when you brought up Soul of a Nation, and that it wasn't so blatantly activist, as you mentioned, but I think it's very important to understand that within the context of a show like that, how it lays the foundations for the way that we're looking at exhibitions, these days, and in terms of a wider inclusion and diversity, that's also a form of change. I think what's interesting and what I wanted to bring up as a topic, I mean, it's not necessarily a question, but I think it's more of a discussion about looking at the context of the Biennale. Because the Biennale also, being the first Biennale in Saudi, bringing together a number of different artists from all over the world, including Saudi. But with a lot of topics that are also very interesting, such as environmental sensibilities, sustainability, or preserving aspects of heritage, or looking at social constructs in society. I think it's interesting to look at forms of activism from different perspectives, and I would like to kind of also maybe open this up to you both to think about, what are the things to consider when you're in a certain environment? I mean, you've talked about putting a show in somewhere in a very, established, I would say, art ecosystem. We say this a lot, art ecosystem, in London. Or you've talked about projects that have come up in spaces in New York. We're looking somewhere very nascent. There isn't this established system here. And I think it's really important for people to understand that there's a reason why there's this very big drive to introduce culture here. And that it's not necessarily about looking at aesthetics. It's about making people think in a different way. Yeah. And how do you think art can really do that?
I think artists help us do that in a lot of ways, because the very nature of what it means to make an artwork, to have an idea and then to turn it into something, makes something that wasn't there or that was impossible possible. And, certainly with Soul of a Nation, I think, don't misunderstand, I think there are many, many forms of activism, and I certainly think that artists can hold both of those roles. What I didn't want to do is kind of purport to be a kind of activist curator with some kind of capital A. I think that was the starting point. And actually, in charting these different groups and ways that things were happening from 1963 to 1983, all of the artists at the time were having to do this for themselves. There was no interest from the Museum of Modern Art in showing their work. Actually, many of these museums weren't even letting us physically through the door, even as, as patrons, as punters, as visitors. So actually, it was entirely, really driven by a desire. I mentioned the Where We At collective, groups of women getting together and someone bringing food and making sure that children were looked after so that other people would have time to do their work. One of the works we had in the exhibition is a painting by Emma Amos called Eva the Babysitter. And I always thought that was an incredibly interesting feminist work from like a Black womanist position, because here she is paying homage to the babysitter who makes it possible for her to have enough time and space to be able to paint this painting. And the child is like almost wriggling out of the frame, even in the picture. It's very, very poignant. But often artists were getting together and then organizing exhibitions themselves. A very foundational figure in the art scene was a woman named Linda Good Bryant, who said she got so tired of this kind of constant lamentation. They won't let us, they won't let us. And she was like, who's they? Like, we can do this ourselves. Let's start a gallery. And she did that. And again, not that it was easy, not that she had the funds to do it, but there was the will and the drive to make that happen. So I think that, again, telling that history in the place, there was also that kind of, I think, very powerful notion of, what was once radical, then, finally being accepted by the institution that had always found it so kind of terrifying. So I think even within these stories that we're telling, there are these kind of levels where, yes, now they're big on the screen, but a lot of this is artists' ideas really helping to kind of chip away at something that had been ingrained, that seemed like, this impossible status quo, things can't possibly change. But, artists leading pickets in front of the Whitney, for instance, that was a way of saying, like, what you're doing is not serving the public the way you think you need to. And again, that some of that then sometimes resorts to like a kind of a re-entrenchment, but eventually I think these things do, the change can happen, but I think it is often led in these ways that don't in any way start at the top. They start from artists kind of making a statement, from people who believe in that work, kind of supporting it in ways small and large, but in ways that actually end up being incredibly meaningful, or that also provide the kind of the roadmap or the template. You mentioned this Biennale being the first, for other people to then say, well, if that's possible, what else could be possible? And those things are, I think, also really affirming, because it creates these building blocks that allow other things to happen.
Thank you both for your thoughts so far. I just wanted to say a few thoughts. I really like your reframing into thinking about it as impact, and then from using the word impact to thinking about mothering, because this is something you can do in many different types of relationships, and then that really goes down to care. And when we feel cared for, we like accept impact in a greater way. So a lot of going to shows or going to any type of performance, art, theater, I think it always feels to me like this offering. And so you feel very receptive and cared for if it's done in a particular way, whether even if it's something, controversial or to make you uncomfortable, it's still like a space for you to shed some layers in a way. And I think for me, I find that super powerful. Like I find what artists do in just making meaning and making associations is a really generous act, to take the time to make connections and then share it, because if you notice some niche thing and you amplify it, like typically it resonates with a lot more people. And I just wanted to share back with you about like mothering today. Zoe, I was showing her a piece that I made, and we were folding it back up together. And I was like, wow, you're being so careful, like with my work. And she was like, this is what my grandmother taught me. And so I think talking about building blocks, like we learn these things that do build these layers of like comfort and support. And yeah, it makes me feel like, okay, more proud or more, connected even to my own work, so.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Hassan Shatti is here. All the topics you talk about is about activism and like reacting to situation outside the art scene. What about the activism inside the art scene? For example, when we went from realism to abstract to minimalism, is that dead, or do we have more things to do?
I never think that there's an art history, like an official one, and then there's always art histories, plural. So even with the artists in Soul of a Nation, there was very much a sense of some people saying, what we need right now is positive images of Black people. Abstract art, that's white art. And then there were other people saying, why can't I express myself purely in color? Why does someone have to tell me what to be? So I think that a lot of this was wrestling internally and within the art world, and not just responding to the bigger political systems. It was about, how can I get a show? how is it that that's not possible? Why is it that even if an exhibition in an institutional space is possible, it's in this tiny gallery by the bathroom or, you know, by the coat check, and it's never a major exhibition? Or, you know, how does, you know, one of the things the Guerrilla Girls were looking at when they started was the fact that at the time, you know, women artists weren't in any way, you know, in equal balance to the program, if there was one shown ever or at all. So there was very much this sense of understanding that what is meant to be, you know, this authority, like providing us access to culture, is wanting in meaningful, in some real ways that needed to be addressed. But often the changes didn't come from the institution soul searching and looking at itself, saying like, oh, what could we do differently? They think they're doing just fine. And it's other people saying, this isn't good enough. And equally, it's other people saying, I don't want anything to do with that. I don't even care. That's not the validation that I seek. I can create my own space. I can do something else. Art for me, if it's in the street and with the people, that's doing what I need it to do. And that's where that no single answer comes from, that this notion of how people find the answers that they need are going to be multifarious. You know, there's not going to be one right answer that fits for everyone, but certainly, you know, even within artists kind of thinking through what's the right thing and what that looks like. You know, I think that the way that activism is expressed doesn't look like one thing. You know, just as you said, you know, with Emily's project, you know, that looks like picking an orange. You know, but that more deeply is actually speaking to displacement, but it is also a very powerful work of art on its own, this kind of poetic, thoughtful, sensitive gesture to connect to another person. So I think that, yeah, I'm never interested in something having to be either or. And I think that artists often, and not to generalize, but, you know, often like have that wonderful obstinacy of not wanting things to be like just this way or just so. And that's what then ends up creating these wonderful forms. You know, there's something that, it doesn't even have to be responding to a lack. It could just be responding from abundance, like all of these ideas within you and how you express those. So I think that there are, yeah, I'm not sure I'm even answering your question now, but I think there are a lot of different ways that artists can actually be saying something that shifts the boundaries and parameters within an art context specifically, even outside of, you know, whether one agrees or disagrees with what, you know, a prime minister has said on the news or something of that nature.
Hello, thank you so much. Some people would say art as activism is the nice way of saying the things or the taboo things that you're not supposed to say. What do you think about that? And is it, sorry, is it then a nice way to let people accept what you're trying to say?
I don't think it's not, you know, about, I think, yeah, I mean, I think art can be about tough subjects. You know, and that's very true of, you know, a lot of the artists that we were talking about and in general. And I think, I don't know, I mean, do I think that, you know, it's, I think actually art is a really powerful way of communicating, you know, kind of injustice, because, you know, its intention is essentially to kind of like instill this like wondrous moment, and you know, you spend time with a work of art and it engenders this like moment of reflection. And so I think, you know, I think to answer your question simply, yeah, I mean, it can be about pain, it can be about grief, it can be about struggle, and it often is, you know, even kind of perhaps like the most beautiful painting or the most beautiful sculpture is really born from a place of sorrow or struggle. So yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much. Thanks for
coming.
being here.